Hi, everyone, and welcome to our cyber insurance webinar series. I'm Lonnie Huffer, Senior Product Marketing Manager for Cyber Insurance. And with me today, I have James Ingram from Arch Insurance UK. He is the Cybersecurity Risk Engineer with them. In today's session, we'll be learning about the underwriting process and application process when it comes to cyber insurance. I'm sure all of you have a lot of questions, and we're here today to hopefully answer some of those questions and help you all understand the process better and how to have better conversations with your carrier or broker about your security investment and overall risk. Hi, James. Thanks for joining me today. How about we start by telling the audience what the heck a cybersecurity risk engineer is and go from there?
That same question every day. My role is relatively new to the insurance market, and what they've done is they've brought in people who are traditionally with a cyber background rather than an insurance background, and they brought them and rolled them into underwriting teams. So I sit in with the underwriters and I'll look at the risks they're writing, I'll help them review security controls, I'll help train them, and help to basically underwrite some of the more complex risks. Whilst also developing our trends and our insurance practices to make sure that we are ahead of the game in terms of the threat landscape.
So let me ask you this question really quick. How is that different than some of the traditional models when they don't have someone like yourself on staff? Because I'm sure there are still a lot of carriers out there that don't have someone like you in their personnel stack. So what does that difference really look like, and what does it actually mean for not only the carrier but for the customer as well?
Good question. It's definitely becoming more common, but it's I think traditionally cyber was a very binary thing in terms of it was very much yes/no questions. The questionnaires went out, yes/no questions came back, and underwriters are trained to know that yes means X and no means no type thing, and they would develop their underwriting practices purely based on those yes/no answers. But as cyber industry's got more and more complex, and as insurers have kind of grown with their understanding, those questionnaires become more and more complex with them, and the risks have become more difficult to underwrite. Those yes/no questions aren't really fit for purpose anymore, so we need to kind of look a bit deeper. It also meant that some insured clients were given a bit of a hard time, really, because their infrastructure or their system didn't fit perfectly in the application form might make them look awful. And what they didn't have is that ability to look at something with different light or a bit of a wider gaze to be able to understand what it is they're looking at. So that's kind of what the different insurers have started doing, is to be able to actually analyze the risk itself on a more granular basis.
You said applications, so we're going to talk about applications now. The reality is I don't think very many people actually like them, do they? And from what I've kind of seen so far, there really is no standardization across carriers or brokers. So the same question might actually be asked a million different ways. So, where does a customer really start with all of that?
Again, great question. And if it kind of makes the customers feel any better, we struggle with that as well. It annoys us. As you say, there is no standardization across application forms, and every carrier, every broker will have their own form to fill out. And normally the content is relatively there, but the way the questions are asked can differ wildly. Some of the kind of the verbiage in there can change, and that could cause a problem with one carrier to another. And at the same time, you get some carriers require a lot less information to underwrite, for example. And if you use their form, and that form goes out, and something like Arch then have to review that form to potentially underwrite that risk, there's not enough information for us. Then we have to go back with loads more, or they have to fill out our form. So yeah, I can see how frustrating that might be. And even then, they're quite complex forms, aren't they? In terms of, you've got to ask who's going to fill them out. The first bit is all about the finances and the business model. So that might be best suited to, say, your CFO or something like that, or your chief risk officer or risk manager. And then after that, a lot of it's about the controls, where your CISO or head of security or something like that might be able to fill it out better. But who takes what is quite difficult, and I can see why clients don't like them.
So, you mentioned several roles in your last statement that probably look at these applications. As a cybersecurity risk engineer, when you're getting these applications in, do you have a sense or a feeling that there's a large disconnect between those different roles that you mentioned and this application process as a whole? And if you do feel as though that's part of the issue or part of the problem, along with the entire application process, what would some of your advice be to maybe help organizations maybe mitigate the gap or the disconnect? I mean, we definitely see it on our side with some of our customers. So I'd love to get the perspective of someone who actually sits on the carrier side and what goes through your head when you see these.
A lot with some of them. I think one of the disconnects is the CISO will fill out the controls, or whoever it might be fills out the controls, the expert on that side. And my first thing for them would be use that application as a chance to extol the virtues of your systems. And all CISOs have pride in their network, they all do, and that they probably quite naturally want to use the application as a way to shout about themselves. Look what I've got this, I'm doing this, these are the projects I'm doing, which is brilliant. And I would say definitely do that. The problem after that is, say, the risk manager or lawyers then get the form, and before they send it off to insurers, they then go through it. And they go through it and red pen it, say, no, get rid of that, can't say that. Because there is a sentiment in the market that people think insurers will do anything not to pay out, or they will use these words against us. One of the relatively new to the insurance industry, one thing I would say and quickly is that that's just not the case. Insurers do want to pay out. That sounds really crazy, doesn't it? But they do want to pay out because that's their product. It's like buying loads of cars from Ford and then Ford never delivering the cars. Eventually, Ford will go out of business.
Right.
And it's the same with insurers, really. The claim is our product. So when we receive a claim, obviously it has to be legitimate and all the other stuff. I'm not saying it doesn't, but they're not going to go through it with a fine-tooth comb and look for every possible word and say, oh no, you said the word and there rather than or something, so that's it, we're not paying out. They just, I say this, they just don't do that. So I think that fear needs to kind of go away a little bit and use the form as an opportunity to sell yourself. And if you find that form, if you find that form isn't good enough, if you look at it and think, I cannot extol the virtues of my network on this application form, then put a couple of slides together or put a 2-page PDF together, just saying, this is my network, this is what I do, this is all the controls I have, just very briefly.
Okay.
What that does when it lands on someone like my desk, I look at it and think, well, this person cares. For a start, they really care. And then on top of that, anything that I'm missing out the application form, I can look at that extra, whatever supplemental form and say, yeah, it's all there. I don't need to ask anymore.
Okay, perfect. So I want to latch on to a couple of things that you said, because I know you brought up the lawyers in this equation. And I know that's a whole nother conversation for another day. But you also talked about providing additional information. And so one of my next questions to you, I think it ties in with this, but I've got another question attached to it, is from your perspective, what's the most important action someone should take when filling out an insurance application? And so what I'm hearing based off of what you just said is provide as much information as possible. And that could take a couple of different forms, I guess. I know you and I have talked before about how there's always like comment boxes on, I don't know if it's most insurance applications or all of them. But I think you told me at one point that was probably one of the most underutilized features, the application. And so I'd love for you to kind of just explain that in a little bit more detail, because I'm sure the people that are watching this today are either not aware that it has such a big impact on the likelihood of them getting an insurance policy or getting a better policy or a better premium because of those things. So would you mind just going into a little more detail about all of that?
Absolutely. And you've absolutely nailed it there in terms of fill out those comments boxes. If I could say one thing to a CISO, just one sentence, it's fill out those comments boxes, because those yes, no answers, the yeses look great. That's very easy. But when you put a no down, normally it's designed that the no's are bad, yeses are good. Not always, but mostly. And some underwriters might just literally go down and go, no, it's too many no's in this form. I'm not even going to spend the time to look at it. Whereas if they are justified underneath in the comments boxes every single time, that's going to make it far more interesting to an underwriter, and far more likely that if this has been delivered to 20 different carriers, all 20 are going to take a look at it rather than the first 5 going, that's it, I've got too much on my plate, I'll just go to a different one. So fill out the comments boxes. I've created a slide to kind of explain my thinking, if that helps in terms of the difference.
Yeah, that would be.
I very quickly threw one together because I knew this question would come up. Can you see that?
Yes, I can.
So this is a snapshot of an application that I received this morning, and that's very basic questions, very simple. If you take that just on those answers, it doesn't look like they've got a great control of their service accounts, and we know they have a PAM or password vault, but no further details at all. So if you could put yourself into an underwriter's shoes, they can look at that and think, well, that doesn't look great. What PAM, right? What other questions can I go back with? Suddenly the workload increases and the difficulty increases of underwriting that risk. Whereas the same answers here, that's the same answers, but then if you put this in the comments box just below it, so in answer interactive logins, they said all the interactive logins are denied apart from just the backup service account, and those credentials are in the PAM. So straight away, that's now a yes. And the 25 characters, well, I put this one in to just be cheeky with it, but 25 characters is very specific, and you do get quite a lot of very specific questions in these questionnaires, which are sometimes quite difficult to manage. Where this imaginary firm has 24 character passwords, but the difference between what you saw in answer 24 and that is there's a huge difference for an underwriter there. Because it's very easy to instantly go to the worst. The fact that it's not 25, in their mind they're going, oh, it must only be like a 6-character plain text password. And
Gotcha.
It's very easy to go to the opposite rather than it being only a little bit worse. And the next thing I highlighted as the term regular. You'll see a lot of these really subjective terms in applications, and what's regular to one person might be completely irregular to another person. And how do you justify that? So so you get an answer here, or we go, well, regular basis to an insurer might be every year, but then to whoever's written this CISO, imaginary CISO, every year isn't regular, and it's just how they've written that form. And the last one was just to say, giving more information makes it look so much better. Yes, we can see they've got a PAM solution. That's great, but we don't know anything further. Whereas even providing a couple of lines about the CyberArk PAM and some of the controls they have implemented in the PAM, great. Now I've got more information. So
okay.
Just to highlight the difference in giving that little few extra comments in the comments box.
Okay, so let me I wanna kind of take what you said and wrap it up. So number one, always add more information when you can, because your application has a better likelihood of being accepted and approved, I guess, for a cyber policy, right? Than one that has just the basic questions answered and they may not look appealing, I guess, to the underwriter that's getting them. And if it looks like if there is no other information, and like you said, if there's a lot of no's, but then something that's a yes, and it seems like it doesn't match, the underwriter can and will most likely pass on it because it's adding more work to their plate, and they have a lot of applications they're going through, so they just want to get through what they can without having, I guess, to, I don't know, increase their time with one that may not be as fruitful. Maybe I'm not saying that right, but I think you understand what I'm trying to say. So for our audience today, if this is as far as you get with this webinar right now, the takeaway is talk with all of the people in your organization who touch your insurance application, from the person who's procuring it to everybody who has to answer all of the questions. Number two, more information is always better. So, whether or not you do have comment sections in your applications, or if you have a small deck, or as James said earlier, a PDF that explains some of the other things in your security stack and why you have them. Really what they're looking for is for them to understand that you know exactly what's going on in your security environment and why. Why does that matter? James, I'm pretty sure you're going to tell me, because Lonnie, it reduces their risk. So I hope I'm accurate in saying that. But those are the first two things that I want you all to take away. We're going to hop on to question number 3. And I think this probably ties into a little bit about what we just talked about. But if a customer is looking for an insurance application, James, or if they're looking for cyber insurance and they're filling out an application, should they be concerned if they don't see certain questions on an application that they may have seen on other applications? Should that raise red flags, and why? So I guess what I'm asking is, we're talking about, I'm an organization and I want to get a cyber insurance policy. I know there's insurtechs out there who are more insurance and technology driven when it comes to the underwriting side of the process. And then we've got carriers like Arch who have a very sophisticated, probably more manual process to a degree on how they look at risk and underwrite risk. So do you have any recommendations or insight into kind of like the do's and don'ts of selecting a cyber carrier, and things that you should look for or should be wary of if you do or don't see it?
In general, the applications, I think a CISO needs to, when they're looking at the controls, needs to ask themselves, if I was the underwriter looking at this, would I have enough information to underwrite my risk? And you're right, there are a few, they are getting better, but there are a few applications that are very light. And you're right, there are insurtechs which will be light because then they've got other scanning things going on and elsewhere, and they're kind of agents and things running to make up for that gap. But the ones that don't, and they get a very light application, the only thing I would say is there are definitely going to be carriers who get that application across their desk who just go, there's just not enough information here for me. So either I've got a choice then, either I can decide not to pursue and not to take that application. Difficulty for your clients there and customers is that they're getting less look at that application. So the more carriers that quote on it, the chances are those prices are going to come down because there's competition there. Whereas the more carriers that go, oh, this is too much effort for me, I need to ask more questions, they're going to move it to one side. Or the alternative is the underwriters go, I do want to pursue this, but I have nowhere near enough information. Then the company that gets bombarded, normally via email, by the broker with hundreds more questions to go and clarify. So they're going to have to answer them eventually anyway. So if they get a very, very light application, I would probably just ask the broker, why is this so light? And is this going to cause me an issue? Brokers are normally, that's kind of their job. They're very good at getting the quotes the company is going to need.
Okay.
If they've given them a very light form, there might be a reason for it, but again, it's worth asking.
Okay. I guess my next question, it kind of tied to that is, I'm sure the size of the application varies based on the size of the organization, right? So if I'm on the SMB side, my cyber insurance application is going to be significantly shorter than that of a large enterprise or something. So I just wanted to provide scale there for anybody that might be watching this and listening. You know, if you're a smaller business, I don't know if you get like 100 question application, if that's right for you. Maybe it is for a large enterprise with thousands and thousands of employees, but I guess from a customer perspective, James, is there some recourse that they can have if, like, they get an application and they think it's not right for their business or their industry? Is there anything to any of that? Or and again, I go back to the lack of standardization. So part of this question is me just not knowing, so I'm asking you, but are there other things that they should look out and be like, oh, hey, broker, Mr. Broker of mine, the application you sent me is 100 pages or has 100 questions. Is this really necessary for a business of my size? I mean, is that relevant to ask? Is that fair to ask?
I think it absolutely is fair to ask. There are some applications that are quite literally 100 pages, and you're right. If you're an SMB business, that's probably a skill, really. Our SMB form is about a quarter the size of our kind of 10 billion enterprise plus form. So there is definitely a scale in terms of the amount of information we need to know. But there's always going to be that fundamental base, right? That kind of the basic information we need to know to write cyber. So I would definitely go back to the broker and just, if you've got any questions, to say, is this form definitely appropriate for me? If it's too heavy, then you can definitely say, oh, this feels too heavy on a lighter form, and they will probably be able to help you out with that. Or they'll at least be able to give you a reason as to say, no, the kind of carriers we want to get on your program are going to want this. And then there's a reason there. But vice versa, if it's too light and you feel the brokers are going down the, I'm trying to say this in a nice way, wing it route of, we'll get a cheap application out there and see what we can do, then that's when we kind of come back to that supplemental document. If you think you're just not getting enough information out in that document, then just put a 2-page thing together, just say how brilliant you are and what you've been up to. There's no harm in that.
Okay, perfect. So for everybody listening, that's like the third time that he said, just provide another 2-page document showing what you're doing. But more information is better. No, and that's great. And I thank you for that. So I'm gonna kind of pivot just a little bit, and let's talk about controls. So I know this is, and the audience may not actually understand what all of these are. I know they're on the insurance application, and they may not understand that these are some of these core things that carriers and brokers look at. So, and I know that controls can also vary by carrier as well. So let's talk about, and let me back up. I also know you're very familiar with trend tools and products as well. So let's talk about controls. What are they? How do you as a carrier look at them, and how do they impact the customer? Meaning, does it affect their premium? Does it affect the policy limit that they can get? Like, and for everybody on the call, trust me, this is all going to tie back to how you answer those insurance applications. So, hey, over to you.
This is a very, very big question. So kind of that endpoint last, in that, yes, your controls definitely have an impact on the price you're going to get, the premium, the coverages you get. It's one of the most, it probably is the fundamental aspect of whether you're going to get given your cyber insurance policy or not. So your controls are everything. Outside of that, there are a wide variety of, each carrier has a different level of what they would consider minimum standards. So if you don't achieve that level, we cannot write our policy. And that would be written into their policy, as in their corporate structure. They will not be allowed to write certain risks that don't meet a certain threshold, which That will vary slightly for all carriers. And it also varies slightly based on the target industry. So again, we talked about the difference between, say, SMB versus large enterprise. The minimum standards for SMB might be slightly different to the large enterprise. We wouldn't expect someone with 50 million revenue to have to implement the same controls as 10 billion plus. But at the same time, we still got to think about it from a loss perspective, in that if they are widely open and they're at very, very high risk of a cyber attack, we've got to think about that risk. So control-wise, I think the really boring one to start with, and the one to highlight, is MFA. It's such an old school control now that everyone kind of rolls their eyes when I say it, but certainly having an MFA challenge on all remote access is critical. And you probably will find some carriers out there who'll write it if you don't, but 90% of them are going to be not entertaining it at all. Now, if there is the odd account without it, and there are mitigating, compensating controls in place for those accounts, then make sure you put that on the supplemental information we talked about. But beware that if you do not have MFA on all remote access, you might struggle. And actually, if I can say this, your clients will be well aware of this, but that's the first thing, and make sure you've got that, because that's going to be the lock on your door. After that, and this one kind of comes back to trend, is EDR. For me personally, and for my underwriters.
I'm going to have you pause for 1 second, because I actually, I have a slide that I can pull up that has a bunch of controls on it. But let me just share it with you really quick so you can take a look at it.
Absolutely.
And you can let me know if you want to maybe talk to what I have on the screen, or if you just want to go through the rest of it. So let me find it really quick.
How's it going so far?
Good. I think I'll probably end up cutting this up into like probably 2. But I have to go through and like cut out all the parts where we went off at. What would be really great is if I could find the deck that I need. Okay, let me share my screen with you. So this is Lonnie's version of this. So are these most of the controls that most carriers look at? Because I went off of like the Marsh control study and then had some conversations with other carriers to understand what else they look at. Mm-hmm. Is this fairly comprehensive for you to maybe talk to, or do you just want to go off of the notes that you have?
I can refer to it, definitely. I can just say that if I'm picking out any on here, then I can just talk about each one.
Okay.
I probably won't go through them all, but I'll just pick out the ones I feel are critical.
Okay. So let me. Okay. Does that work?
Yeah, got that.
Okay. So then,
do you want to go from the top with the controls question, or?
No. So I'll just start with, okay. Because I liked what you said about the MFA. So then why don't you just say, second to MFA would be EDR, because you were saying, I know, because you were referencing trend and talking about EDR. So why don't you just start from there?
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Let's go straight into it.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so after MFA, the next one for me and for our team personally is probably your kind of EDR, your endpoint protection platform. Now, that's not all platforms are the same, not all platforms are equal. Not to say so much trend, but you're one of our top platforms. And it's key because at the end of the day, the more sensors you have out, the more chances you have of identifying something critical before it takes hold or before it causes too much problems. And your EDR wraps up all of those sensors into a manageable platform, which I think is key. Outside of anything else, without really your EDR XDR, those sensors aren't deployed, which means a lot of your other security controls don't fire anyway. So it's kind of that key core control for us. At the same time as well, now you've got kind of your XDR capability, you're you're expanding where those sensors are being deployed to. So you're not just looking at endpoints anymore. And that aggregation of all the different logging is the visibility you're getting from that is a really powerful control for us. Now, I'm not saying XDR is a minimum standard for us, but EDR probably is, or it's very close to being a minimum standard.
Would you say that EDR is a minimum standard and or required for most carriers out there today? And I ask this question because we have a lot of customers out there who maybe still only have endpoint protection only. And I think just kind of based on what you said right now, there's a lot of risk around just endpoint only because there are so many other devices attached to the network and so much other telemetry available. So what would your advice be to maybe customers who still only have endpoint protection, who don't think migrating to the next level is important to their business?
I think that in general, the difficulty is the complexity of these attacks have increased no end, especially in the last few years, and the methodology that these attackers are using to move through a network are getting cleverer and cleverer. So you're kind of up your old school endpoint protection platforms basically just relied on signatures to say this looks like malicious code, I'm going to stop it. It's still a really useful part of the tool, but that's not the entire toolbox anymore. And those kind of behavioral analytics you get with an EDR platform and the wider deployment of sensors is just you're going to decrease your chance of a major incident no end in my mind. But I also understand that if you're a tiny company that say only got 3 or 4 endpoints, I understand that you can control it, and especially the behavioral stuff in other ways. But in general, we've kind of attackers have certainly moved beyond the limitations of just endpoint protection.
Okay, so I know you're familiar with Trend Vision 1, and now that we're talking about EDR, XDR, I know those are controls, but one of the newer things that has popped up is attack surface management or attack surface risk management. And I know that that's not on the control screen yet, but I'd really like to get your thoughts as a carrier on the addition of ASRM and how it I guess compounds or adds value to customers who do have EDR, XDR, and I guess how you see ASRM differently than XDR.
I think being able to manage your attack surface is key. After your kind of your social engineering and legitimate credentials, your email attacks, essentially, I think exposed vulnerabilities or exposed devices to the internet is something like 40% of all attacks. So having a really good grasp of what you have exposed, and not just what it is, but kind of where it is, what it's connected to, the connectivity of it, the versioning, and everything else that goes along with managing your attack surface is absolutely key. And on top of that, then being able to integrate it into your other platforms is even more key, because there are a lot of platforms, we use them as well, which we can monitor attack surface. And a lot of the bigger carriers will have an attack surface monitoring tool of some kind to do their assessments of an insured. The difficulty we have is attribution. So we have to go along with like DNS records and certificates and everything else to work out what IPs are associated with what company. Whereas having it built into your endpoints, you know exactly what your IPs are, and you'll be able to monitor your own attack surface better than certainly a third party would be able to.
So when we talk about, when I kind of look at the controls on the screen right now, I see kind of this balance of proactive versus reactive technologies. And as a carrier, I think maybe up until a year or two ago, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, I think there was a lot of emphasis put on the reactive part of the technologies that are out there. But I would say in the last year and a half or so, I've really seen this kind of like trend, no pun intended, to really start to enable organizations with having proactive technologies in their security stack to really help them be more risk resilient and really kind of just have a better grasp of and I say monitoring, and that's probably not the best word to use, but monitoring their environment, to really understand, I guess, the vastness of everything that's connected, and to really not only to be able to know for themselves, but to be able to report to like boards and to have that information for carriers like yourself of what their exposed assets are and what they're doing to actively identify and mitigate all of that. I'm assuming you see ASRM as one of those proactive technologies, and if so, like, how do you see the proactive side of some of these tools with what carriers are doing and trying to do to identify and underwrite risk better?
I think you're right. I think the proactive side is definitely becoming more prevalent in the way that these attackers are, once they get a foothold into a system, they can move so quickly and they can cause so much destruction in minutes. I think Lockbit can encrypt data at a rate of terabytes in minutes. So the idea of reacting manually to something is after it's happened is a bit too slow almost. It's still useful, you still need it obviously, but to be able to catch it in its tracks and stop it dead is far more important. That's kind of where your kind of EDR, XDR sensors in blocking mode is going to be key. But at the same time, understanding your attack surface and seeing those vulnerabilities and those insights quickly, and then saying, as soon as an exploit is released, as soon as a vulnerability is released, be able to say, I've got exposure for that, and I am going to mitigate that instantly, as quickly as possible. That's absolutely key. I suppose that folds into the ASRM folds into vulnerability and patch management in a way, because your external infrastructure, your attack surface is the key thing to be able to manage quickly, because that's the thing that's going to be exposed, right? Well, immediately exposed if it's exposed to the internet.
Okay, I guess I never actually thought of it that way. So thank you for bringing that up. Okay, so we've talked about MFA. That's number one. That's what you guys all look for. Number two, EDR, XDR. So what on this glorious screen in front of us would you say would be the next control to fall in line? And maybe just in looking at most of these, what would you say are maybe the top 5 or 10 that most carriers tend to look at? Because I know with what I have on the screen, some of these are specific to other specific carriers out there. But I would love to get your perspective and whether or not these are all the controls that Arch specifically looks at, but giving the audience an idea of, if they don't have one of these on the screen and they should, which ones should those be?
Okay, difficult question. So outside of MFA and XDR, I suppose one of the next ones to highlight is email. It's kind of obvious in the fact that a vast majority of attacks still are coming through some sort of phishing capability, or they're at least gaining the credentials through email. So it's the fundamentals really. It's having those it's content filtering, malicious attachment, links filtering, ability to detonate a sandbox. It's the fundamentals of being able to manage your email and web profiles, I suppose, as well. So you're looking at web proxies and making your DNS protections, those kind of things, to make sure that what your staff are viewing on the internet is protected, and then what they're receiving via email has gone through the required filtering, as much filtering by technology as possible. I'm not saying that training isn't an important thing, because it definitely is, but you can't rely on the human element all the time. So try and take as much of that out of it as possible with the controls first. After filtering, after emails, it probably goes back to our vulnerabilities as well. We want to make sure that there is a good grasp of vulnerability and patch management, in that anything that's externally exposed, especially, that there is a target time to remediate as quickly as possible. 72 hours is normally the time bandied around, in that that's not necessarily patching, because the CISOs listening to this will understand you can't just immediately patch everything quickly, but it's being able to remediate in some way, whether that's isolate, whether that's block it on your firewall, whatever it is you might be doing.
Okay.
Reacting to it. And we're not talking about every critical patch, but anything that's exploitable. I'm talking about like your log4js or those mega critical 0 days that come out.
Right. So I just want to highlight for everybody on the call right now. So if you have Trend Vision 1 XDR, you could take advantage of those playbooks, and much like what James is talking about, set up automated plays for if something does come through, email, for example, or whatever, you have the ability to quarantine it, block it, isolate it, whatever it is that you need to do. And then actually within the platform too, and James knows this very well as well, because he's seen it, we're already doing that vulnerability prioritization for you, right? And James, let's talk about that for a hot second. So you've seen our console, you've seen the data inside, you know what our risk score is, but you've also seen how we prioritize vulnerability globally because of our large customer base, and how we assign criticality scores to those different vulnerabilities. I think I have two questions here. One is, knowing that you know what that information is, do you see any value or benefit for a trend customer, for example, or an insured who has access to that type of information, and being able to share it with you guys in some capacity? Like, I know we provide mean time to patch and the number of vulnerabilities that are within their environment. And from a vulnerability perspective as well, if you see, and I say see in quotes because I don't know how often you can actually see this, but are there specific vulnerabilities, for example, that if a customer has in their environment, you guys will be like, no, we are not going to touch this until that has been resolved? So getting into a little bit of like, how do you guys see that information, if you can see it at all? Would you like to see that information from the customer? And if so, how does it benefit the customer from an underwriting perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it comes back to that point earlier of more information the better. So if there is a way that you can demonstrate your rapidity of patching, or the fact that your external infrastructure is completely clear of any external critical vulnerabilities in a snapshot, brilliant, because that'll save me the time and then having to do any sort of scans or anything. So I'd love that. But at the same time, some of the questionnaires might have kind of, you say mean time to patch, or your compliance rate for your targeted, say it's 72 hours for CVSS 10s, or what's your compliance rate for that? Well, you can pull all that information out of the GUI, can't you? So any of that information you can provide is going to evidence how well the company is managing vulnerabilities. If you just think about it from an underwriting perspective, if you think that information would be good for an underwriter to see, then yes, absolutely, it's something we would want to see. Very rarely would that. I can't think of any reason why, if that was put in front of me, I wouldn't want to see it.
Okay. Perfect. Because I know we've had talks before. We are trying to work on creating a report that our customers can share with their carriers and underwriters to help make the conversation hopefully a little bit easier, right? So there hopefully isn't as much back and forth. So we've got MFA, we've got XDR, we've got the email web filtering, and then vulnerability prioritization. What's the next hot topic on this list before us?
Kind of wrapping recovery into one giant bubble. So you've got backups and plans. Let's just wrap that up together. The fundamental question from the underwriter is, can this business recover after an incident back to where it was prior to the incident? Does it have that ability? And all of that kind of comes into it. The plans and everything will help in terms of the rapidity of going back to that original state and how well it's done and how efficient it might be. And then you're going to need to have the backups that are there and suitable and sufficient to be able to get you there in the first place. So on plans, we want to see plans that are detailed, in place. We didn't see the plans, so we are kind of taking it for granted in what they're saying sometimes, unless we get to meet them, which we do sometimes, but not always. But even without the underwriting hat on, it's having seen so many incidents and claims from our perspective, response plans never work out the way customers think they're going to. So spend time, really get into the weeds of it. You can't over test it, you can't over exercise it. So really think about when everything is burning down and everyone's even the feeling and the sentiment of the engineers at the time, they're going to be feeling awful. They'll be stressed, they'll be tired, chances are it's going to be on a Saturday night. And it's just how structured those plans are will make a huge amount of difference to how efficiently they recover. At the same time, backups traditionally were there in the event that the system failed. So there's been this kind of crossover where actually backups now are very much in place for, say, your ransomware comes in or an attacker comes in and blats the environment. But the traditional way of having your backups just hooked up to a backup server hanging off your network is now no good, because the first thing those attackers go after is your backups. That's literally the first thing they go through on their reconnaissance, because if they can destroy the backups, you're going to have to pay them. Right. Otherwise, your system's never coming live again. One of the things we look for is a sufficient backup that is suitably protected from a malicious attacker in the network. So that could be offline, it could be tape deck somewhere, it could be an iron mounted, it could be anything like that. Whatever you've done to maintain them in the event of a ransomware attack. Even things like, and this is kind of a bit specific, but you've encrypted your backups and you've kept them offline, great. But your encryption key for those backups is kept on your corporate network in a Word file, which is now encrypted. So you can't decrypt them. And your response plans, you've got these amazing response plans that are awesome, and you've nailed them down, and you've kept them in a PDF on your corporate network, and you can hit by ransomware, and now no one can see them. And right. we have seen that on multiple occasions. So when you're playing these out, including your backups, play them out as if the network is gone. All screens are dark. All right, how do we do this?
Okay,
that's one big tip.
Okay, so I want to hop on some things there that James just said. So you're not talking just about incident response plans. You're also talking about like business continuity plans and disaster recovery as well, right? So
absolutely, yes.
You don't necessarily ask to see them. You're trusting that they're there, but based on what you've seen, you've deduced that there are a lot of companies out there who aren't really great at them or practice them on a regular basis. So For the audience today, if you're taking anything away from this, if you do have an incident response plan, please practice it. You may even want to run it by a law firm who specializes in cybersecurity law, or one of the breach coaches that we've partnered with. They are more than happy to help you run through and test those incident response plans and help you build the disaster recovery plans and business continuity plans that you may or may not have as well. Second to that is, James talked about the network. If you've got important stuff on the network that pertains to things on the backup, figure out another spot to have it all. And here's where I'm going to plug Breach Plan Connect. It's offered through a partner of ours, Net Diligence. James is very familiar with Net Diligence is, and the great thing about Breach Plan Connect is that it's a pre-written incident response plan that is available on an app on your phone. So should your networks get encrypted, as James just mentioned, you can now access those incident response plans on your mobile phone. So just a little plug there for those two things, because I think they are important to what we're talking about. And I, of course, want all of you to be as safe as possible and to help you to reduce your risk. James, one of the things that I've heard a lot about are privileged access management solutions. That's come up a lot with people I've talked to, as well as 24/7 MDR. So if we can maybe talk about those two things really quick, and then I'm going to hop on to our next question. You know, as a carrier, and again, I'm not 100% understand exactly what all is involved with privileged access management and how you as a carrier see that, but I do really understand the value of having a second set of eyes on your security environment at all times, especially with organizations who either built the product specifically or those that have trained cybersecurity professionals that have been in that space for several years, who are able to spot things rather quickly. Can we talk about those two things really quick?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, you've definitely said, as you said, PAM is privileged access management is a hot topic with insurers. Over the last kind of couple of years, they've really gripped it. I think partially that's because identity and access management is a very difficult thing to assess externally. It's very difficult for me to look at an application form of 10 pages and know exactly how a customer or client is managing their AD environment and managing access and privilege accounts and everything else, apart from just asking how many do you have and some of the basics. It's very difficult. So PAM was this wonderful tool that insurers could latch onto in a way that if you had it and everything was enrolled into it, then there's a kind of an assumption that at least they're going to be managed to a certain level. So I think that's kind of why they grabbed onto it so much. But Arch don't require a PAM tool. It's definitely a nice to have, and it's a good one to see. And I think as they're becoming cheaper and easier to get hold of and easier to implement, I would definitely recommend people go and look into them. But we want to see evidence that the client is managing their identities, especially privileged identities, appropriately. So that's least privilege, that's making sure they're only using the most privileged accounts for the most privileged reasons, preferably vaulting those credentials, not reusing them, certainly not using them for day-to-day. Those kind of things is what we want to see. As long as they can evidence that, we can take it that they don't have a PAM.
Okay.
But it's still nice to see. On the next one, the kind of 24/7 SOC NDR solution, that the 24/7 bit is probably the bit that's there's a bit of flex, whereas having a SOC or something managing the alerting on your network and dealing with security, it is important and it is key, and it's something that it would be a kind of minimum for us in that those logs aggregating into your SIEM or your XDR solution, someone's got to be reacting to those. The tool's going to do an element itself, but you can't rely on it 100%. You're going to want to be able to tell it what it should and shouldn't be doing. So we do look for it. If normally, you're right, 24/7, because most attacks happen on a weekend or a Friday night, and if everyone's gone to bed, then attackers have 2 days of fun before anyone comes in on Monday. However, I think it's perfectly legitimate that a customer and a client can justify in a way, oh, do you know what? All of my alerting for my XDR is sent to my laptop, which I have at home, and I'm on call 24/7, or we have a team that's on call. And I'm not saying, you know, a $20 billion healthcare entity, they would get away with that, but but a small kind of SMB entity, we would look at that in a very different light. And as long as it looks like it's being considered and thought of, it's okay. As long as something is there.
Okay, so again, I think that all goes back to sharing that information during the application process. And I guess now that we're talking about this, and I don't think I had this question sent to you before we hopped on this webinar, but you know, let's talk about, and I know we're going to have another section about this, but if somebody has a cyber policy and they go and they're in the process of renewing that policy for the next year, if they've added new controls into their security stack, how important is it? Because, and again, I don't know how the renewal process really goes, but I'm assuming they're filling out another application, or no? So maybe let's start. Normally,
yes. Normally, yes. They would fill out another application form. It might just be a supplemental form. It might just be last year's was the big base one, and then we've got like a 3-pager for this year or something. Okay.
So how important is it for, and this may even be mid-year, right? So let's say they got their policy on January 1 and now it's June, and they've added in, they've switched over to XDR, they've added in, you know, an MDR service, and let's say they've added a PAM solution. Is there any recourse for the customer to come back to the carrier or broker and say, hey, I've added these things into my security stack. By doing this, does it affect my premium or whatever? Like, can it be adjusted, or do they have to wait until it's renewal time in order to like have that conversation?
Good question. My understanding, not being in insurance for a million years, but normally it's wait till renewal, I'm afraid. It's at renewal time, that's when they get a chance to present their new terms. I know there's a couple of kind of policies out there that are they're implemented in a slightly different way to standard, and there might be adjustments based on almost like but they would have to be almost pre-agreed prior to inception. And certainly Arch and other big carriers might do that. If we know there's a project on the horizon that, say, within 3 months there's going to be a PAM tool, what we might do is say sublimit. So you might have like a 10 million policy for your entire network, but we might limit, let's say, ransomware to 5 million, because and then as soon as that PAM is in place, that then jumps to 10 million. So the premium doesn't change, but the policy coverage might.
Gotcha. Okay, that's really great to know. Awesome. So I kind of want to wrap this all up in a bubble really quick. So controls. How do they affect a policy or premium? So more controls equal better policy, lower premium, or not always, or it depends on the organization, or what does that all look like?
You've pretty much just answered it for me there. That's pretty much the answer I'm going to give you. So yes, your better controls in general lead to lower premiums and better coverage. In general, your premiums are going to be based on things like your kind of the fixed static things about your company, the size of the company, your number of employees, your revenue, the amount of data you hold, the type of data you hold. So if you're holding healthcare data, that's far more valuable and far more sensitive to say, your standard PII data, like names and addresses and emails. So the content of your data and how much of it, that will affect your policy as well. So all of those things will give you a base rate, almost kind of like that's what your company value is, and then they'll overlay your security controls on that, and then that's what builds your policy. So think of it as almost like a discount loading factor on your base rate. So if you've got poor controls or controls that aren't quite up to standard, there might be a loading factor to the point where it's unwritable and they won't want to write the risk.
Okay.
Or the other way, where you've got brilliant controls and then your premiums come down, your policy coverages go up. They might actually throw in extra coverages to try and attract you as a client because they think you're brilliant and those kind of things. So controls certainly come into the factor of it. And at the end of the day, that is the core of what we're underwriting, is the control.
So James, we talked about controls. I want to talk specifically about Trend Division 1 for a second, because you are so familiar with the technology, and knowing that it's an XDR platform and can handle multiple types of telemetry. As a carrier, let's say you have a Trend customer come through who has Trend Vision 1, for example, and I don't know your insurance application in and out, but let's say for whatever reason that customer comes through and they, say, oh yeah, I do have an XDR solution. It's with Trend. I don't know if insurance applications drill down to the different types of sensors that a customer can potentially have within their environment. So how do you, as a carrier, how would you look at something like that? Knowing it's a Trend customer, knowing what Vision 1 does and what it has, how do you kind of see all of that?
So absolutely. Again, this comes back to what we said earlier about how the insurers are evolving and their understanding of security controls is evolving. It started off as endpoint protection, then it's EDR, XDR. Now they're starting to ask themselves, what is XDR? So that's, again, when they're hiring cyber people into the things, and then that's kind of our role, to look at that a bit more on a bit more granular basis. And certainly we would ask, what sensors have you deployed on that? If we wanted to drill down more, and if we thought if it's something that we really wanted to chase, we would certainly ask, and we have done on Trend systems as well. We've said, what sensors have you got deployed? What percentage of the network is deployed? And those kind of things. The good thing there is, if you think about our applications and underwriting, and this is pretty much the same across the board, just think of it as categories is the easy way to do it in terms of controls. If you look at ISO, CIS, NIST, they all kind of block controls into categories, and that's roughly how insurers think. And an XDR has sensors in multiple categories. So if you've got a great endpoint protection platform, Trend, well, firstly, that's one of the first things we look for, is the quality of that platform. Great. So your endpoint protection box category is ticked almost. But then if you think, well, actually, I've got the identity module, and which is managing all my identities and looking if vulnerability there and looking for misconfiguration and those kind of things. Well, if you let us know that, then that's now the identity and access category. That's another tick box for that. And then the same with the network. Okay, that's another tick box for network topography and network security. So you can see how those modules are actually not just endpoint protection, they're actually expanding across multiple categories. So providing us with that information, not all insurers are going to ask for it, because they're still probably bringing themselves up to understanding it. Whereas if you provide that information and just say, even if you just said, I've got 10 micro Apex 1 with these modules deployed in the text box, that would probably be enough for even a uninitiated underwriter to be able to go, oh, okay, that's better, and I can at least try and categorize that a bit. So yeah, absolutely.
Okay, and correct me if I'm wrong, but sometimes, maybe most times, being able to share that information to show that you do have that additional telemetry coming in also it provides better insight for you, but also delivers the benefit to the customer of perhaps a better discount on their premium, because they've got that additional information. And that's because you guys see that as risk reduction from your side, because they're seeing more is better than less. Did we get that all? More is better than less.
And that's absolutely right. And that's what I'm saying. In each category, there's going to be almost every carrier does it differently. Every one of them does it differently. But essentially, if you just allocate almost the discounting based on each category, the more evidence you can show of a higher level of capability in each category, your aggregated premium discount is going to increase. So if you only had amazing endpoint protection, but everything else was bad, for want of a better word, your discounting is going to struggle. Whereas if you can spread that across everything, discounting is going to increase.
So would you say that you would see an insured in that light that has those additional sets of telemetry coming in as having an improved or an increased level of cybersecurity maturity? We talk about that a lot at Trend internally, and so I want the audience to kind of understand there's this cybersecurity maturity that carriers and brokers look for, and then and maybe it's the same side of the coin, I'm not sure, but then there's also this, cybersecurity posture. And are those two different things in your mind, James, or are they kind of like the same thing?
I think they all equal the same thing in the end, in terms of that general. I know by the end of it, all these things kind of come into an instinctual feel about how well a network is being managed, and even the amount of care that's gone into it, and the amount of even things like buy-in from management. You can see by having a top platform that their board has obviously bought into security being a high priority, because they wouldn't other have it. So it's those kind of things that you can kind of infer from these controls as well. So it all ends up being the same thing.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so James, I know we've talked a lot about controls, the application process, what insured should be doing, what they shouldn't be doing, what they can be doing better. So my last and final question to you today is about actions, right? So what types of actions can disqualify a potential insured, or red flags that you might see when looking at underwriting an organization? And we've probably covered some of this already, but I'd like to just kind of get it in one full boat from your perspective on things that put them on the naughty list, let's say, and maybe prevent them from getting the right policy that they need because they either are or they are not doing something.
Yeah, so it's a good question, and difficult to put your finger on specifically. So one of the things I'd say in general is that insurers want to write the risk. They want to provide the insurance. So as soon as that application form comes across their desk, they open it, the first page, and they open it with, I'm going to do everything I can to write this. So it's only then negative elements that then kind of diminish that sentiment. So the first thing I would say is that we've kind of touched on it at the start, in that the applications can be burdensome and painful and quite frustrating, especially for a CISO who might be quite proud of how good their network is. And we get this certainly in some territories around the world, that they don't want to answer these questions because they feel they're being like, well, how dare you ask me that question? And it's things like that. And what they don't understand is we need that information to be able to write the risk, because we don't know. So I think one of the first red flags is being short, and this sounds a bit crazy, but almost aggressive in the applications, in that they're almost having a go at the insurer, who's the person who's reading, this poor underwriter who's reading it. It just feels like they're being almost attacked on the page, like, how dare you ask me this? Why have you asked me that? And stupid question, all those kind of things written down, because straight away that's going to put them on the back foot. So, well, I think my first thing is most insurers are coming at this from a point of positivity. And I know that the applications are painful, but if you put that same positivity into it, that will sync up, and that will help. At the same time, obviously, each carrier is going to have a minimum standard that they've agreed with. So if it doesn't meet those minimum standard thresholds, they won't be able to underwrite the risk. So there's some things you just won't be able to do. They won't be able to change. And if you haven't met those minimum standards, you're going to struggle. But your broker will be broking this deal to a number of carriers, and each one of them have slightly different minimum standards. So don't worry about that in general, but just think about your posture in terms of, at the moment, I don't want to talk too much about insurance in terms of the background functionality of it, but we're in a bit of a soft market, which means that carriers are generally more accepting of risk, and there's more carriers vying to write risks. But there's an expectation that that's going to change and that's going to flip and become a harder market, and in which case it's going to be harder to get carriers to write risks, and they're going to start reducing their appetite and making these minimum standards a little bit tougher. So just have that in the back of your mind and think, right, I need to match these minimum standards. And it's not just for your insurance, it's for your company in general, because cyber attacks can be a horrendous thing to have to deal with. So so I think minimum standards, and then just not providing the information we need, or providing it or not providing it, and then saying, why do you want me to provide this? I think that's probably some of the red flags we would see.
Okay.
But outside of what we've already spoken about in terms of controls, there shouldn't be too much. Provide more information is the topic.
Ladies and gentlemen, provide more information. Controls are your friends. Incident response plans are your friends. Business continuity plans are your friends. Disaster recovery friends. More importantly, test them, and test them regularly. I think James can probably attest to the number of claims or things that he's had exposure to over the years on the question was answered. Sure, we've got an incident response plan. And then someone gets breached, and then it comes out maybe that, I don't know, we haven't looked at it in 12 months. This is my opportunity to tell you all to please pull it out of the drawer, dust it off. Maybe engage a breach coach or a law firm to take a look at it. Run through some tabletop exercises to, make sure your organizations are prepared and know how to run through those different plans. Your best defense is your best offense. So James, do you have any other takeaways that you would like to give to the audience today before we say goodbye?
I think we've covered everything from my perspective. I think if I say provide more information one more time, I'm going to get something thrown at me through the screen. So I think that's everything from my perspective.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I hope everybody watching this webinar got some really great information out of it. If you've got questions, I will make sure we have a slide at the end that has my email address along with our cyber insurance email address at Trend, so you can ask additional questions. But for now, we'll say goodbye, and I wish you all the best of luck.